Good morning. Here you go. So I guess I don't need to explain what LSEP stands for, right? So everybody in this room knows it. But, so at the Apollo, during the Apollo missions, astronauts deployed a group of scientific instruments at every landing site. Then they're collectively called Apollo Lunar Surface Experiment Packages. Then, then every landing site consisted of different mix of science packages. And just to give you an idea, so I have a panorama. Oops, here you go. Panorama pictures that were taken by astronauts James Irwin in Apollo 15 landing sites. So that was one of the most expansive LSEP operations, and it consisted of a number of instruments, including seismometers, magnetometer, solar wind spectrometers, heat flow probes, my favorite, and superthermal ion detector, and there may have been one or two that was not in the picture. So these instruments kept running long after the astronauts went home. They kept transmitting data till September 1977. That's when NASA decided to pull the plugs on those instruments. And so that's what my the data tapes generated from those time is the focus of my talk today. So, and the data that was transmitted to the moon were received at the manned space flight network stations that were distributed around the globe. And so those data were recorded on the tapes that were called range tapes. And the range tapes were sent to the Johnson Space Center for further processing. Then there, the JSC personnel extracted data from separate instruments and then sent those data to the principal investigators who were responsible for processing and analyzing those data. Then during the around mid-1970s, when the PIs completed their analyses, they delivered their data to the National Space Science Data Center at Goddard. Then also the JSC started making these archival purpose tapes that were called archive tapes. Then archive tapes were meant to be a sort of a master digital tapes that included data from all the instruments from one LSEP station. So then, so each day they generated a tape like that for each Apollo landing site. So that means they generated 5 archive tapes every day. Then, according to the reports that were written back then, so these archive tapes were sent to the Washington National Records Center, which is a facility of the National Archives. So this is a timeline of these tape productions. And then, as you can see, the range tapes are produced through, oops, sorry. The range tapes, wrong slide there. The range tapes were produced all through the time. And then archive tape production started in early 1973. Then, in 1976, University of Texas took over the tape handling operation from JSC. And then they started making something equivalent of archive tapes then. The problem is that right now, only as far as the raw data from these missions are concerned, okay, only the one from this time were safely digitally archived at the NSSDC, all right? Then, so you may think, oh, wait a minute, I just said that all the PIs delivered the data to NSSDC, and they did, but they were not required to deliver the raw data. So that's why many of the investigators didn't. So they delivered their results of the analysis and the results of their process data. Then also, many of the PIs' contracts ended in early 1975. So that's why there are quite a few data that were left unprocessed, okay, in the last 2 or 3 years of the LSEP experiments. Only the seismometer data kept being processed afterwards. So that's why then, so all the tapes that were, oops, sorry. I hate this one, sorry. All the tapes went missing afterwards. And then according to the reports written back then, all the range tapes supposedly went to Goddard. But the people who are at the Goddard right now have never seen them. All right. Then, as far as the AXAF tapes are concerned, only a couple reports say these tapes are sent to WNRC, but there's no more detailed information about how you can actually recover them. Okay, then it's not like you can just walk into National Archive and start poking around tapes, right? So that's why until last year, no sort of a contemporary researcher have not been able to verify that those tapes really existed. So that as a source of frustration for for researchers like us. Basically, there are a number of researchers now who have new ideas. They want to re-examine the ALSEP data, and then that requires reprocessing of the raw data, but they don't have access to the raw data. So that sort of motivated us to start hunting down the data from the raw data from those periods, especially the AXAF data, because AXAF data are digital master tape that included the data from all the instruments. So finally, this slide. Okay. So that motivated us to basically form a sort of a volunteers. Then I called our group the Raiders of the Lost AXAF tapes. Okay. So named after one of my favorite movies. Then so we are sort of some of the volunteers in the NLSI ALSEP data recovery focus group. Then our mission is to recover all the AXAF tapes, about 5,000 of them. All right. Here. So then, like I said before, you can't just walk into the National Archives and start poking around. So that's why one of the first things we have to do is to find a document that actually showed that the JSC sent those tapes to the National Archives at a certain date and how many tapes, etc. So I was able to obtain help from the record center of the JSC, then start going through these old documents, and eventually found some documents that actually showed that AXAF tapes were sent to WNRC in the period of 1975 and 76. Then after that, I arranged a visit to the National Archives last year. Then was able to finally verify that at least they have 450 of those AXAF tapes, okay, in store. And those included the data from April through June of 1975. But unfortunately, I also found through these document search that there are used to be a lot more AXAF tapes stored there, but about 2,000 of those were later removed in 1980. Then we don't really know where those tapes went. All right, and so the JSC sent the tapes, so that's why only the JSC people were able to remove them. But there's no record about where those tapes were sent afterwards. So that's another thing. We are sort of doing more detective work on that matter. Then, but at least we have 450 of them. So that's why we started now going to the next step of actually reconstructing the data processing workflow used by the principal investigators. Then my interest is mostly heat flow, so that's why I'm going to be just using some data from the heat flow data as an example. Then many investigators, of course, did not write down the processing flow in detail in the publications. So we have to go back to all sorts of documents in terms of a heat flow experiment. The principal investigator, Michael Langzess of Lamont, so he's been dead for the last 15 years. So I cannot call him up and ask him what he did, right? So my Goddard colleagues went to Lamont a couple of years ago, and then they searched through documents left behind by Mark, then found some clues. Then, so we are in the process of actually reconstructing what exactly he did in processing those data, because the data that were received from the ALSEP stations, as they are not scientific numbers. Those are just reading from various parts of the instruments. Voltage readings, some frequency counts, that kind of stuff. So that's why you need to be able to process them and making them scientifically meaningful numbers. So that's the step we are working on right now. Then just to show you, so this is what Langzess and others wrote as some sort of a final report in 1976. Then as you can see, so this is sort of, this is a sort of a schematic diagram of the heat flow probe they used. So they drilled a hole, and they had the sensors installed to make temperature measurements. They kept measuring temperatures for several years. Then, so this is a sort of graph that shows you what temperature at certain depth, and started from Apollo 15, 1971. Then it ends in 1974, because again, that's when their contract ended. So they did not process, as far as we know, they did not process the data that were collected after January 1, 1975. So the tapes we found actually are from 1975. So that's why we can see how these trend went. So since I'm running out of time, so that's why I'm not going to make too much interpretation on the data. Here you go. But so this is the comparison. So here is the one, the last day of the heat flow data that was analyzed, okay, previously. Then, so December 31st, 1974. Then here is the data we extracted from the tapes we recently found. Then, so at the end of 1974, we are seeing this kind of gradual warming trend in the subsurface. Then we can tell that seems to have kept going. Then another thing you can notice is that, see, so the new data shows you a lot more tiny wiggles, right? The reason for that is actually our instrument measured temperature every 7 minutes, okay? But the data delivered by the PI, okay, shows you temperature every 50 minutes. So somehow he sampled the data down, all right? But now you can see by looking at the raw data, actually, you do see measurements every 7 minutes, right? So that's one of the sort of advantages of actually having raw data and reprocess them. Okay, so anyway, I'm not going to get into the interpretation, so I'm going to just go to the conclusion now. Okay, so this is sort of the take-home message for my talk. So we must fully restore and preserve the ALSEP data because as surface experiments go, the ALSEP's scope and the duration of observation have never been surpassed by the more recent robotic missions to anywhere. All right. Then surface experiments of this kind may never be repeated again. The way the NASA budget goes, right? So in the last 4 decades, so the data analysis and interpretation techniques have improved, right? And the computers have become much faster and more powerful. And some scientists have found new ways of utilizing and interpreting the data. So there are still a lot of previously unprocessed and yet to be archived data. All right, so that's why much of and then also for those archived, much of the data must be reprocessed for contemporary researchers. All right, so that's why our mission continues. Okay. Thank you very much.
Any questions?